The leaders of Armenia and Azerbaijan signed an agreement in the White House aimed at ending nearly 40 years of hostilities. The deal gives the United States exclusive development rights to a transport corridor through Armenia, linking Azerbaijan to its Nakhchivan enclave bordering Turkey.
Now, while President Donald Trump has already congratulated himself for brokering an alleged peace deal between Armenia and its foe, Azerbaijan, the reality is that the trilateral agreement is simply a framework for a possible peace treaty that would be signed later after a few details are ironed out and negotiated. But there are many obstacles to a final agreement, and that's what we're going to discuss today. Now, one point of contention, the main point of contention between Armenia and Azerbaijan is access to a corridor that runs along Armenia's southern border with Iran. So take a look at this map because it helps illustrate the issue at hand. Armenia is represented in the light blue, while Azerbaijan's territory is shown in the darker shade. As you can see, Armenia splits Azerbaijan into two land masses. There's mainland Azerbaijan, shown on the right-hand side of Armenia, and then you see Azerbaijan's exclave on Armenia's left-hand side. So that geography has obviously created some issues for Azerbaijan, and here's what they want to do about it.
Azerbaijan's exclave Nakhichevan. It has no connection to the country's mainland, and in between is Armenia. Why is this a big deal? Because the two states argue over how Azerbaijan could connect to its exclave.
There must be easy access from mainland Azerbaijan to Nakhchivan. There should be no checks, no interference, and this is our legitimate right.
But it's Armenia's land, so the idea that Azerbaijan should be able to travel freely with no checks, no border security is absolutely ridiculous. Basically, the Azeris want a corridor connecting its mainland to its exclave that again would run through Armenia's southern border. Otherwise, they have to rely on flights above Iran's airspace or a lengthy train ride through northern Iran. And Azerbaijan does not have friendly relations with Iran at all, so that could be an issue, right? Now, before we go any further, we really do have to understand the historical context that led us to the hostilities between Armenia and Azerbaijan, because they weren't always enemies. In fact, during the Soviet era, when both countries were under Soviet rule, things were very different.
In the early 1920s, Armenia and Azerbaijan were conquered by the Red Army and became part of the Soviet Union. Their borders were delineated under Soviet rule. This map from 1928 shows it well. Two territories received a special status, laying ground for future conflict. To the west of Armenia, an Azerbaijani exclave of Nakhichevan was created. And within Azerbaijan, the area of Nagorno-Karabakh, populated mostly by Armenians, was granted autonomy. But back then, they were only administrative borders within one country, the Soviet Union. People could easily travel without any border controls, and in many places Armenians and Azerbaijanis were neighbors and colleagues.
Now, those friendly relations changed rather dramatically as the Soviet Union grew weaker in the late 1980s and war broke out over land and territory.
But things changed fundamentally when the Soviet Union started collapsing in the late 1980s. This is when clashes erupted between the Armenians, who are mostly Christian, and Azerbaijanis, who are mostly Muslim. The administrative lines on the map became real borders and reasons for conflict in the run-up to Armenian and Azerbaijani independence in 1991. By then, a full-fledged war had erupted over Nagorno-Karabakh. It is internationally recognized as territory of Azerbaijan, but mostly Armenians lived there. After 6 years of war, Armenians won and took control over Karabakh and bordering territories, displacing some 500,000 Azeris. It was during this war that Azerbaijan's connection to its exclave was cut off. Having Azerbaijani trains run through Armenia became simply too dangerous. The last train passed through here in 1993.
So due to their growing conflict, Armenia shut down the railway and corridor connecting mainland Azerbaijan to its exclave on the other side of Armenia. Then things got a lot worse in 2020 when war broke out over Nagorno-Karabakh, which Armenians refer to as Artsakh. Take a look.
Thanks to revenues from gas and oil, Azerbaijan has heavily invested in its military. The country, governed autocratically by President Ilham Aliyev, started retaking Karabakh from Armenia. By the way, Azerbaijan bought many of its weapons from Israel. Israel is a strategic ally who wants to counter Iran's ambition in the region. In 2020, the Second Karabakh War broke out. Azerbaijan now dominated the battlefield, and a ceasefire was signed under Russian mediation. It was in this document that Azerbaijan secured the demand to connect to its exclave via Armenian territory. Armenia agreed to guarantee the security of transport connections between Azerbaijan and its exclave Nakhichevan. And keep in mind one important detail. According to this document, these were Russian soldiers who shall be responsible for overseeing the transport connections.
More on Iran and Russia in just a minute, but since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia has been providing security at what's actually called the Zangezur corridor. That's the corridor that we're having a conversation about right now. Now, this pathway is going to be renamed under Donald Trump in order to honor Donald Trump if a peace treaty is signed, but that remains to be seen. But Russia essentially providing security at that corridor makes sense when you consider that this strip of land is located at Armenia's border with Iran, an ally of Russia's. But the relationship between Armenia and Russia has weakened considerably in recent years. Although Russia has historically been one of Armenia's closest allies, Moscow was unwilling to intervene and protect ethnic Armenians as the Azeris declared war against them in Nagorno-Karabakh. And while Nagorno-Karabakh is in fact internationally recognized as Azerbaijan's territory, the Azeris have also invaded and occupied parts of mainland Armenia. Russia hasn't followed through on its security guarantees. And the one thing that Russia did do is broker a ceasefire between Armenia and Azerbaijan, but the Azeris broke it in 2023 and declared war once again. Over 100,000 Armenians were ethnically cleansed from Nagorno-Karabakh, and Azerbaijan took control of the territory. Now, since then, Armenia has given up territorial claims, but there are other critical sticking points standing in the way of a peace deal that honestly no one is talking about in American media, which is why I'm doing it. So first off, Armenia demands that refugees from Nagorno-Karabakh at least be granted the right of return, even under the governance and control of Azerbaijan. That has not been addressed in the framework that Trump brokered at all. Secondly, there are still 23 Armenian servicemen and civilians that Azerbaijan currently has detained as prisoners of war. Investigations by the United Nations Committee Against Torture and Amnesty International have concluded that the POWs have been tortured and abused. Armenia believes that any peace deal should require the release of these hostages. I should be specific. The Armenian people feel that way. The Prime Minister of Armenia, Nikol Pashinyan, seems a little weak in this area, to be quite frank. That's my read of it. Now, Yerevan considers 16 Armenian government officials, including the former Artsakh state minister, Ruben Vardanyan, seized after Azerbaijan's September 2023 invasion of Nagorno-Karabakh, to be political hostages or prisoners of war. But Baku, the capital of Azerbaijan, is prosecuting them on trumped up criminal charges of war crimes and terrorism in lengthy show trials. Unless Azerbaijan releases its hostages, it is unlikely Armenia will agree to a final signing of the agreement. Let's just pause right here for a second in regard to war crimes. War crimes also include some of the actions taken by Azerbaijan during that war in 2023, including decapitating 2 elderly people as they were alive, civilians, during the war. So you want to talk about war crimes? Come on. Now, the framework for a peace treaty mentions missing persons in Article 9, but not specifically prisoners of war. I think the wording is a little strange. It reads that the parties undertake to address the cases of missing persons and enforced disappearances taken place in the armed conflict, which involved both of the parties, including through the exchange of all available information about these persons, directly or in cooperation with relevant international organizations as appropriate. The parties hereby acknowledge the importance of investigating the fate of those persons, including searching for and returning the remains as appropriate and ensuring that justice is served in relation to these persons through proper investigations as a means of reconciliation and building confidence. Corresponding modalities in this regard shall be negotiated and agreed upon in detail in a separate agreement. So let's pause again, because separate agreement. This is, again, not a peace deal that Donald Trump brokered. It is a framework. It's incredibly vague. It is not detailed. And quite honestly, it doesn't deal in detail with the very specific sticking points, the conflict between Armenians and the Azeris. Now, the prisoners of war are not missing. We know where they are. Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister, Anita Anand, brought up the lingering issue and called for the release of all Armenian detainees and prisoners of war, the safe and dignified right of return of Armenian civilians, and the preservation of cultural heritage. A lot of ancient Armenian churches in Nagorno-Karabakh were pretty much destroyed, bombed, you get the picture. But the most important issue is Azerbaijan's unwillingness to respect Armenia's borders. In fact, beginning in May of 2021, Azeri soldiers crossed several kilometers into Armenia, and they're currently occupying 83 square miles of internationally recognized Armenian territory.
Teachers sharing their now long and difficult journey to work after their village school was abruptly cut off from the main highway, caught in the middle of a conflict.
Part of the road, 3 or 4 kilometers of it, is under the control of the Azerbaijanis. They claim it belongs to them.
They'd say even Yerevan belongs to them.
For the past 2 years, the teachers have been forced to take a treacherous detour down steep mountain roads. What used to be a 15-minute drive now takes an hour. The school sits in a border village in the Armenian region of Sayunik, which has found itself right up alongside Azerbaijan for the first time in decades. Here, many teachers and pupils are fearful that Azerbaijan now wants to go further, chip away at their land, and drive the Armenian people out.
They're advancing step by step. Their goal is the total and definitive extermination of the Armenians and the seizure of our land.
So does this framework of an impending peace treaty address this? Well, yes, actually it does. The text of the agreement says Yerevan and Baku will relinquish all claims to each other's territory, refrain from using force against one another, and pledge to respect international law. But since the signing of the framework for a possible peace treaty in the future, literally after, the dictator of Azerbaijan continued making claims to Armenia's land. And that's a problem. That's a huge problem. And there's nothing in the framework about a security guarantee for Armenia to protect its sovereignty, especially considering Azerbaijan's encroachment, land grab, and history of breaking ceasefires. In addition to that, the European Union has a mission deployed at the border to monitor ceasefire violations, which Baku has repeatedly demanded it withdraw, which honestly is not a good sign from a country that has violated ceasefires in the past and has demonstrated repeatedly an unwillingness to respect Armenia's borders. Now, keep in mind that Armenia does have an economic interest in opening up the Zangezur corridor. Currently, its border with Azerbaijan and Turkey are closed, which of course limits its economic development. Now, theoretically, through a peace agreement, those borders could open up, but right now, at this moment, Armenia can only trade with Georgia, which is located at its northern border, and Iran at its southern border. But the Azeris don't want Armenia to conduct passport control, border control, or even customs control, even though the corridor would run through Armenian land. And honestly, this framework does not address this at all. Also, a critical point to remember is that southern Armenia shares a border with Iran, an important trade partner for the Armenians. But Iran also happens to be an enemy of the United States thanks to its close and costly relationship with Israel. And under the framework of the deal, the United States would provide security for safe transport through the corridor instead of Russia, thus threatening trade relations between Armenia and Iran. In fact, Iran has already come out to say that they are against this framework. And they're worried about encroachment, or meddling in Iran's, dealings. So look, remember, Russia and Iran are allies. And personally, I don't trust the United States on this matter at all. I don't, because I don't like or trust its allies. I don't trust Azerbaijan for obvious reasons that I've outlined on the show, or Turkey, which committed a genocide against the Armenian people in 1915 and still refuses to acknowledge or recognize that they did it. And I certainly don't like America's subservience to Israel, which provided the weapons Azerbaijan used to ethnically cleanse Armenians. So you have a group of countries that quite honestly couldn't care less about Armenians or Armenia, essentially taking control of a critical strip of land at Armenia's border with Iran, which I don't think is great. Finally, there's one other thing standing in the way of a finalized peace treaty between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Although the text of the present agreement does not require an Armenian constitutional amendment, after the August 8th signing, Aliyev, the dictator of Azerbaijan, reiterated his demand that Armenia amend its constitution to eliminate what Aliyev calls baseless territorial claims against Azerbaijan. Now he's referring to Nagorno-Karabakh. And guess what? Armenia is planning to have a referendum. So Armenia has indeed planned to hold a referendum on its constitution in 2027, the draft of which should be ready in June of 2026 before Armenia's next general election. By the time the referendum takes place, though, Aliyev's continued demands and hostile language will foment tension in Armenia that may discourage passage. So, first of all, this signing was not for a peace treaty. It was just an agreement that they're gonna work toward peace, which is good, you want that. But the way that it's kind of being marketed in American media and by the Trump administration would have you believe that they're like buddy-buddy already and everything's great. It's not great. As you can see, actually signing a peace deal is gonna take at least a few more years, and there's still a lot of obstacles standing in the way. Plus, securing the referendum that Aliyev demands, right, to change the Armenian constitution would require the support of 800,000 Armenians, which obviously is not going to be easy. Now look, the final thing I'll say about this is I would love for genuine peace and good economic relationships to like blossom in that region, in that part of the world. I would love for the border with Turkey and Azerbaijan to open, for trade relations to actually be established. It would be wonderful, but the problem is the lack of respect for sovereignty, for Armenia's territory. And the reason why the United States is involved in this is, yes, they stand to benefit from the trade that is likely going to happen through that corridor. There's no question about it. Armenia would also earn some interest, right? Some money from the trade that passes through that corridor, which is a great sign. It's just that I don't trust the parties involved. And the reason why the US is also involved in this is they want to choke off Iran and also lessen the influence of Russia in the South Caucasus. So why do they want to do that? Well, for obvious reasons, Iran is a foe of Israel's, and the US loves to do Israel's dirty work. And remember, Russia is an ally of Iran, so weakening Russia would further weaken Iran, and it would also pave the way for a regime change war, which is what Israel desperately wants. All of these things are connected. And in the middle of all of it is a tiny little country that is surrounded by its enemies, and that country, of course, is Armenia. So it doesn't have a lot of leverage, it doesn't have a lot of great options, and in a perfect world, if you believe in magical thinking, oh yeah, they're totally gonna sign a peace deal, trade relations will be wonderful and everyone will benefit. But that really does remain to be seen. So I'll stay on the story, I'll see how this develops, and I'll give you some updates. But right now, honestly, there's a lack of trust that's guiding my feelings on how this is developing.
Every time you ring the bell below, an angel gets his wings. Totally not true, but it does keep you updated on our live shows.